Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We are at 6:31. We're just going to give folks a minute or two to get logged on, and then we'll get started. Thanks. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started here. We'll just start out with some housekeeping items. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Alex Tarantino. I'm PDI's Kent County Vice President and Chair of the Education Committee. I want to welcome you all to our second installment in the 2023 Historic Preservation Webinar Series. Tonight's webinar is called Is This Original? Tips for Investigating Historic Architecture, presented by Kara Smith, who's one of our PDI board members. So thanks, Kara, for being here. And I also wanted to say thank you to Tetra Tech, who's our 2023 webinar series sponsor. So before I hand it off to Kara, just want to remind all of our attendees of a few things. So everybody is muted. So if you have a question, we encourage you to use the Q&A button that's located at the bottom of your screen. And don't worry if your question isn't answered right away. We're keeping track of all questions and comments that we're receiving, and we'll have plenty of time after Kara's presentation to answer questions. You can also use the chat box to get in touch with Kara or I if you're having issues or technical difficulties. And then I also want to let you all know that this workshop is being recorded, as are our other webinars. And so it'll be available in a couple of weeks on Preservation Delaware's YouTube page and our website. And lastly, if you aren't already a member of PDI, I encourage you to consider joining and or donating. Your support helps keep events like this one free, so we really appreciate that. And we'll post more info in the chat for you as we go on here. So without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker, Kara Smith. Kara is a new board member of Preservation Delaware as of October 2022. She's also an associate with John Milner Architects in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. She's been with the firm for over 10 years, working as a preservationist, architectural designer, and project manager. Her clients include private owners of historic residences, academic institutions, religious congregations, other architects, and government entities, including the architect of the Capitol and the National Park Service. Whether she's writing a building preservation guide for a national landmark or designing a new shingle-style residence, Kara's work is always centered in the realm of historic preservation and traditional architecture. Kara is an adjunct professor at the College of Architecture and Built Environment at Jefferson University in Philadelphia, and she also serves on the boards of the Delaware Valley chapter for the Association for Preservation Technology and the Philadelphia chapter of the Institute of Classical Art and Architecture. Thanks so much, Kara, for being here. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to speak. I'll just share my screen here. And thank you all for being here tonight, spending the evening with us. Thanks again to Tetra Tech for being our sponsor. I'm really excited to share some of my work and experiences with you for this webinar for the next 45 minutes or so. I'm not exactly sure who we have in attendance tonight, but we're mostly professionals or just enthusiasts. But tonight I want to speak about the basics of the architectural investigation process, as well as touch on some technical information and areas of professional study. We'll cover some of the features and materials that preservationists analyze in historic structures. And then I'll take you through a case study of one of the most, I think, interesting and puzzling restoration projects that I've worked on so far. So yeah, over the last 10 years at John Milner Architects, I've been fortunate to work on a number of locally and nationally historically significant buildings and project sites all up and down the East Coast. As Alex mentioned in the introduction, the work of our firm is extremely varied, but tonight I want to discuss one of the more challenging subjects within the preservation field, and that is private residences. So on the surface, historic homes are simple subjects, right? But the restoration process is often much more complicated just due to the inherent characteristics of homes. They're private, they're mostly unregulated after construction, meaning homeowners can sometimes make some wild design decisions on their own. And they're subject to frequent modifications, right? So such as when a new owner takes over a space. But lastly, homes are typically undocumented, right? For example, how many of us have gone to touch up the paint in our living room only to realize we never wrote down that exact shade of Benjamin Moore paint, or we've remodeled our kitchen and baths without drawing detailed plans of the existing cabinetry first. Like many of us, the men and women of the past that constructed the properties we study today typically didn't stop to document their spaces just in case one day they might be listed on the National Register. With all that being said, we wish they had, or we wish that they kind of broadcast pertinent information kind of obviously, as can be seen, the initials and construction date on the gable end of this brick pattern house in New Jersey would be really helpful for us. Even if the clues were a little bit more subtle, such as the initials and date carved into this door jamb, a small note like this can contain a lot of information on the development and construction history of the site. For those of you who missed our last webinar, Historic Graffiti with Michael Emmons, I highly encourage you to go check it out for more information on markings of this type. Like Alex mentioned, our videos are up on the Preservation Delaware website. It's not there yet, it should be soon. So, but unfortunately, preservationists aren't always so lucky to have these details literally written on the walls. And as a result, one of the most frequently asked questions I received from historic property owners is, while they're standing there pointing to a piece of trim or a door or an entire room, is of course, is this original? Why is this asked so often? What does it mean if it's original? Often in my work, when a client has come to us to advise them in a construction project, the question that they're really asking is, what is the appropriate preservation approach? Can I tear something down or remodel something or a space without significantly altering the historic integrity or value? Or should I try to maintain the character defining features exactly as they appear? To be able to answer these questions and ultimately inform a preservation strategy that may include restoration, rehabilitation, reconstruction, demolition, or a combination of such. Our first step is to initiate this architectural investigation. In an investigation, we analyze a building to establish and document its original appearance and the chronology of physical change that has occurred over its history. And although this is important in any preservation project, I hope that you find tonight's lecture is not just a how-to or a technical guide, but that instead you take away kind of a renewed sense of curiosity for historic structures. So maybe the next time you're standing in a historic building, you look kind of beyond what meets the eye and start to hone your observation skills. Maybe we move the emphasis from what's original and start to consider what the changes in a building tell us about the people who live there, and how cool it is to see some of these physical architectural evidence or clues that connect us to this people. So let's dive in here. There are, of course, many different types of investigation. The ones that we'll talk about today are really things that are mostly observational or research-based. How we typically start the investigation process is by gathering background information from written documents, if they're available, and sources related to the building. So I'm pretty sure a lot of you are already familiar with the common documents that we study. They include property deeds, Sanborn maps, fire insurance maps, National Register nominations if they're already completed, primary sources such as diaries or oral histories. I love the Sanborn maps that you can see on the left here because they not only outline the footprint of a building, but often how many stories there are and the material used too. So they're always fun to look at. We also extensively use drawings and photographs from Historic American Building Surveys, or HABs, programmed through the National Park Service. And we'll refer to these a little bit later as well. We often examine the historic context or the general geographic, cultural, socioeconomic history of the area. A great example of this that I like to refer back to is how the architecture type of the Trinity Row home in Philadelphia was common during the 19th century. It's a one-room building for 3 stories, where typically wealthier merchants owned a plot of land. They built a row home facing the primary street, and then within their courtyard spaces were homes of tradespeople, widows often, who occupied these much smaller spaces. And this info is illustrated in city directories for Philadelphia. An example is McElroy's. They listed the names, the addresses, the occupations of the residences, and then we could coordinate them, their exact address with fire insurance maps like this, and figure out where people lived and what they were working on, and kind of the context that they were surrounded in. Another major source of information, of course, is precedent studies, where we look at similar building types, regional architectural history, and if the architect or builder is known, some of their other work. Precedents help us identify trends, whether it's a certain building technology or development and construction technique, or maybe a shift in popular style. But all of those items help us develop a relative timeline. Of course, it's very rare that you find exact replicas in your precedent studies, but as we can see here, it is possible. Once we have all this information gathered, we have a head start by the time we actually get on site to begin analyzing physical evidence. Here, on site, we look obviously at what's remaining, but we also try to understand what is missing, which is a little bit tough to do sometimes. For example, are there scars on existing masonry from the flashing of a former porch or a pent roof? Are there nail holes in studs that are spaced regularly where plaster lath may have been removed? But by simply looking at a keen eye, taking notes of maybe empty mortises, joist pockets, irregularities in brick patterns, or interruptions in running wood trim, you can start to compile clues that when you combine with your other background information, they begin to illustrate the history of the building. Of course, to be successful in this endeavor, it does help to have some knowledge of construction technology and material history. So I thought I'd review some of the most common physical features that are used to date architecture just through simple observation. The first is, of course, overall design or architectural style. As mentioned with precedent studies, popular styles or trends are well documented with coordinating time periods or eras in field guides, such as this one, and they describe almost every type of architectural style with examples of their character defining features. So references like this are always a great place to start. After an initial construction phase, you can start to analyze the overall massing of a building, which often tells the evolutionary history, which can be seen here in this kind of telescoping example of construction, where the campaigns are distinctly separated in similar yet slightly varied forms. And they're also distinguished between materials as well. Let's see here. Additions are often expressed in masonry structures, as can be seen in the vertical seams of this exterior wall of this building. Although the color, the size, and the shape of the stone is fairly consistent between the primary structure on the right and the addition on the left, the surface of the stone is flush and seemingly continuous from afar, but that seam does indicate a later construction campaign, as do the heavier cornerstones on the right that originally supported the outside corner of masonry. You can also see how they contrast the smaller kind of infilled stones to the left of that seam. Every once in a while, a mason throws us a bone and installs either a date stone or maybe stamped bricks like the Metropolitan brick here. With a little research, we can usually date these materials with typically fairly consistent accuracy. At this timber frame residence that's from the early 19th century, breaks in the siding pattern indicate additions that were similar to the masonry seams that were shown previously. In this example, it's a little hard to see because of a strategically placed downspout, but I assure you that that break in the siding is all the way up the eave. The shift in massing from the original gable at the front of the building to the right of that picture to the low slope roofs at the rear also indicate potential historic roofing materials. We can assume that wood shingles were common at the time of original construction, were used on the steeper main gable. But however, wood shingles would have been inappropriate at the rear additions with the low slope because it doesn't provide proper runoff and water can get trapped underneath the shingle. So it's likely that metal or tin may have been used at these rear areas. So that's another example of kind of how the massing can be expressed in different ways. Moving from the exterior of a building to the interior, we can take a look at exposed wood framing or finishes. Timber frames with mortise and tenons or balloon framing or nominal lumber all indicate general time periods that are representative not only of structural design techniques, but also in advances in the milling and finishing processes. Saw marks, I think as most of you are probably aware, that are left on unfinished wood can be indicative of lumber milled directly at a building site, or maybe it's clear that it came from a larger lumber yard. Here we can see an evolution in hand split lath, most noticeably on the upper right corner of the ceiling, versus saw cut lath on the far right corner next to the door, which is much more regular. So this is telling us that there was clearly a later modification at that door where they actually installed a closet wall, just by looking at the differences between that lath material. Irregularities in glass are also a great, excellent indicator of construction eras, as the manufacturing techniques have evolved in such an extraordinary fashion. Early fabrication of crown glass, like on the top left diagram, produced really small panels with sometimes circular or waves or bubbles as a result of the hand blown and spun production techniques. Later, cylinder glass, as shown on the right, allowed for larger panes, but still lacked some of the clarity and perfection of float glass, as seen at the bottom image, which we still use today. So these are just some very small collection of elements that we study. There's so many more, such as door hardware, nails, fasteners, that we don't have time to touch on tonight. But I just wanted to emphasize that it's really the study of these kind of individual elements that shaped our understanding of the building and guide us to the appropriate interventions and preservation strategies. When we start to look at the bigger picture, or the combination of all these elements, it helps to put those observations onto plans or onto drawings. On paper, sometimes conclusions could be drawn that aren't so obvious while you're standing out there in the field. For example, looking at this area of siding from the exterior of this building, where there's no other siding on the building, we couldn't figure out what the heck what was it doing there. But after drafting the existing conditions in plan, we could see that this section is a wood frame wall to allow for a minimal thickness so that the door could open into that hallway. Have yet to figure out why exactly the door is located in this spot in particular, but hopefully we'll figure that one out soon. I keep learning on every single historic construction project that I'm involved in, whether it's a strange anomaly like this example, or whether it's from a collection of puzzling features that are that I'm going to give an example of in a case study that I'd like to present to you tonight. So this is the Baldwin Bus House in the small town of Hudson, Ohio. It is just south of the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, and it is a former residence that we are currently restoring as part of a larger project with another architect, Peninsula Architects out of Ohio. This is a really exciting project for me. I hope you find it interesting as well, because determining the chronology of development really has been such a puzzle. And I really got to use a lot of the investigation strategies and that we just discussed. So this photo is actually from 2020, just a few years after the last residential occupant passed away. The property faces a public green, which is owned by the city, and it is directly, and I mean directly, in the center of town. So it's on the National Register of Historic Places, but more importantly, it is revered by the locals and assiduously protected. So we were kind of under a lot of scrutiny for this project, but they were great to work with. The earliest documentation that we had for the property are deeds. We know that it was bought in 1813 by a man named Augustus Baldwin, and it wasn't until 1824 that a value for the property was listed in the deed records. In the following year, 1825, the value increased more than 5 times, from $150 to $820. So what happened? Just that small jump, small to us now, pretty significant cost difference back then, indicated that something was happening. Was the entire house built within that year? Was there already a structure on the property that Augustus was living in from 1813, from 1825? What exactly was Mr. Baldwin up to? So that's kind of what we set out to find in our research here. In 1856, Augustus's widow, Anne, passes away, and the house is sold to John Buss. And this is when our first documentary evidence with visuals appear. So you can see at the top of the screen, there's a little tiny train map that shows a kind of cluster of three masses. And that's our first kind of footprint that shows up. In 1874, there's this artist rendering that unfortunately we only see the front of the building. And this is a good time to kind of give out a warning. Just artist renderings are not always super reliable. There is, of course, artist interpretation. We don't know if they made it look fancier or added details or didn't feel like drawing something one day. So just take any renderings that you do see with a little bit of a grain of salt. But it does give us some indication. There's a 2-story mass, a 1.5-story L, porch, two chimneys. So we can start to think about what was there in 1874. By 1890, John Buss, who's the second owner, has passed away, and then the house is listed as an inn owned by his grandson, who was a bachelor. We're thinking maybe looking to make some income off the property by renting out some of the spaces. Then in 1906, we have this image at the bottom of the page here, which is actually showing the rear of the home. I'll try to zoom in a little bit with this image. It's very grainy. So, but what we can make out is those three masses, right? So we have the 2-story, the 1.5-story L, and then a maybe 1-story mass at the rear as well. So it's blurry, but we can also see a filled-in porch at the rear and get kind of the general mass or shape of the building. In 1907, the house is sold to the last family, the last owners, who are the Marino family, and they occupy the home into the 21st century. In the 20th century, the home is lauded for its classic and refined details and is featured in multiple periodicals. And then the granddaddy of them all, the U.S. Department of the Interior, National Park Service, starts to show interest. As we flip from 1929, I want you guys to kind of notice the French doors at the first level, fan light, and kind of the detailing here. By 1934, when the Habs team comes to document the site with the upper photograph, you see there is quite a large porch added to the front, and railing. By 1964, this photo down at the bottom of the screen, which is also Habs, but just 30 years later, you'll see that porch has been screened in. There's dormers added, and it's looking a little worse for the wear, I think. The Historic American Building Survey, the program began in 1933. And as I mentioned, the Baldwin Buss house was documented in 1934. So it's safe to say this is probably one of the first properties to be documented by the program. Today, we regard Habs as one of the premier architectural, documentation programs. They're known for their painstakingly detailed and accurate drawings and photographs. But I just want to keep in mind, at the time this photograph was taken in 1934, this house is already over 100 years old, and it's already on its third owner. So we know that it's already had a lot of changes and, has already strayed away from its original appearance. These are some of the drawings. We have elevations and floor plans that they completed. And I want to mention that, again, that, Habs is very detailed. And if you look at a drawing from 1960, that have said it's likely to be, you know, so accurate that they draw walls crooked that are crooked or shingles missing. But unfortunately, that's not exactly the case kind of in this initial phase of documentation. If we take a look at the first floor plan on the left and the second floor plan on the right, and then there's some written documentation that came along with this 1934 survey, we start to identify some discrepancies between their own documentation. For example, they outline that there are 3 of 4 original fireplace mantles still in place. But if we look at the plans that they have drawn, they have 1, 2, 3, 4 fireplaces that are still open. They mention a sun porch that you can see in the photo that was built a few years ago and has ruined the facade of the 2-story part of the home. So they're acknowledging in the written text that it's there, but they are omitting it from the actual plan drawing. So this becomes an issue, right? When you're trying to think of how to restore a building to the original appearance. With this last comment, it's clear that they're adding some level of interpretation or opinions in their documentation, which we now know is a really inappropriate thing to do, because it leads to conjecture. So we can't really describe with any certainty what was actually there in the 1930s, let alone in the early 1800s when it was constructed. Another example of a discrepancy here is that 1874 photograph where we see the porch infilled at the rear. We see it again in the 1934 photograph, but once again, it's missing from their first floor plan. So with this information, we could also, use those plans as a starting point to look at how the building, has changed and what it looks like today. On the right is the floor plan, the first floor plan from 2020. So you can see how it's evolved and really exponentially grown. When we were hired, there was a new owner that wanted to restore the exterior, but also wanted to use the space in a way that benefited the community because of its, prominence right in the center of town. It would no longer be a residence, but it would be incorporated into a new campus plan for an art gallery and the headquarters for a local nonprofit foundation. So we had 2 questions that we wanted to resolve to help them out. The first was, how should the exterior appear in its restored condition? And how can we adapt the interior for the new use without compromising the historic features that remained? So we continued our documentary search. We learned that this entire region in Ohio was settled in the beginning of the 19th century by farmers and merchants from the New England area. They settled in this area with an abundance of forests and lumber, which allowed for easily translating the wood framed and clad architecture of New England into this new location. So luckily, Habs did document not just the Baldwin Bus House, but an entire series of this architecture of the Western Reserve, as it was called. In these photos, we studied examples of this local architecture that Augustus Baldwin was not only accustomed to at home, but was also seeing reinvented in the Cuyahoga Valley. We see a lot of high-style federal detailing, including elaborate dentil cornices, Adams door surrounds, fan lights, lap siding on the secondary facades, flat board siding on the primary facade to look more like masonry, ionic pilasters that are often tapered, so they're larger at the base and smaller at the top to appear taller. I will point out on this image, this example was highly modified in the 1890s. They literally took off the gable roof and put on a new hipped roof, added these Italianate brackets and a monitor and the new windows and the front porch. So this looks a lot different than it used to. Just wanted to throw that out there. We also studied the fenestration, the window patterns, and the massing. So many of these buildings of this area, location at the time, had these gable end entrances with the doors that are off center there. So we had a lot of examples to study and take a look at. It's likely that the pioneers of the Western Reserve were not hiring architects as we think architects are employed today. However, there was specific guidance in the form of architectural pattern books and designers. Asher Benjamin was probably the primary source for a lot of these residential details, which were copied and modified to suit specific conditions by designers such as Lemuel Porter, who a lot of these buildings are attributed to. We see two examples of sketches directly from A Country Builder's Assistant by Asher Benjamin, where the details from the book are on the left with the example in the Baldwin Bus House on the right. Although identifying the source of the details is helpful for dating features, just keep in mind that pattern books were republished pretty often. Details would get printed in multiple issues over decades, sometimes being updated to reflect current design trends. So for example, federal details became distinctively more Greek revival as popular culture kind of shifted preferences from the 1820s to the 1830s. So it's important to not take the dates that they appear in these books as gospel truth. After we review precedents and sketches like in Asher Benjamin, we once again turn back to the physical evidence, so what we can see and observe at the building site. So here's a plan showing some of our observational notes where we're notating, open mortises, breaks in the sill plates, infilled door openings, that kind of thing. And then here's another detail where we we wrote down all the framing members and notated, what was new and old, and there was a serious evolution of framing within this building. There was also 4 different types of foundation in the building. So if you remember, we had, 2 primary masses, the 2-story mass and the 1.5-story mass, the L, as I like to call it. But yet we still had 4 types of foundations. So we had rubble stone on the L. We had cut stone with sandstone veneer on the 2-story, which was later, we assume, deepened and reinforced, as you can see on the right, the top right. There was also brick in some of the latest editions, and then there was this hodgepodge, which featured brick, very early CMU, terracotta, and all of these items there were kind of indicative of 20th century construction. So we kind of knew that was a later addition. We also looked at the framing. So we were lucky in this case, specifically at the 1.5-story portion of the building, or the L, because a lot of lucky in a way that we could do a lot of selective demo and exploratory work because the finishes had already been replaced in the 1960s. So we could open up the walls and really examine what was there. And the most significant find that we could see is that there were 2 distinct structural framing systems. So that let us know that that 1.5-story portion of the L and the 2-story portion were likely built at separate times. And just from our studies of massing and construction techniques, you would assume that, you know, if the 2-story portion was built first, that the L would kind of die into it and use some of that framing for support. But no, we had two very distinct separate masses here. This is supported on the first floor. If you can see on the right, the open tenons where we assume the original exterior wall would have been. There's also just a little side note here. If you take a look at that door opening, there's a primary structural post that has just been kind of cut off and made way for a later door opening. So there's kind of just disregard for structural systems, and you kind of did what you wanted here. Another part that made this house pretty confusing was that there was a lot of reused or recycled materials. So you can see on the left, the top left is just one example of an empty mortise that we found so many of. And then also a divot at the bottom left of, you know, where likely a log cabin, we often see in log cabin construction, where, you know, you have two round pieces sitting on top of each other at 90 degrees, having that divot, it's kind of indicative of that. So this kind of led us to believe that there was probably a structure on site before kind of these two masses were erected, and they just reused the material. Another example of reusing material is at the roof of the 1.5-story L. On the left, you can see the original roof framing with timber rafters that are kind of irregularly spaced and sized, and board sheathing. On the right, you can see the nominal or the modern lumber that was probably installed in the 1960s when they did a huge expansion of the building. But they reused that board sheathing for the roof structure. So just to reuse materials and you know, save, but makes it a little bit hard to kind of clearly identify construction campaigns. Another pretty cool example was the joist log framing that's in the first floor of the 2-story mass, where we actually have the bark still on it. So this, we can assume that they likely just took trees from site, carved out tenons, stuck them in the mortars of the sill plates, and didn't bother, you know, even shaving off the bark or cleaning it up. So that's found in both the floor framing and the roof framing of the porch. And this is really an example of kind of the unfortunate modifications over the years. You can see a lovely decorative beam that you know, has this nice beaded detail on the edge. It has a stained finish. It's actually a little bit of a color, so we assumed that they were exposed. But unfortunately, when they made their addition, they cut off the ends of these beams so that they no longer spanned the original footprint. And then they also kind of hacked off the bottom surface so that they could install a flat level plaster ceiling. So unfortunately, these were not exactly in salvageable condition. And then just some more cool things that we found here. At the L, there's a little bit more of a primitive envelope. So on the left, we're looking at the back side of lap board sheathing siding without any sheathing. So they're just putting the finished material directly up against wood studs. But then in the 2-story structure, they did have sheathing. And you can see on the right, they kind of stopped it at the angle of the roof of the 1.5-story structure. So that's another indication that that smaller piece came first. And then just some other quirks that we found when they installed that porch at the front of the building. They unfortunately, just dug right into the pilasters there. There was a pretty cool early Dutchman repair on the top right. And we can assume that the siding that's on the exterior of the building is original, just one, primarily because of the amount of paint. There was such a buildup. But also we studied the nailing patterns and the nails that the siding was held in place with. So this is the interior of the 2-story section, which was largely intact. We knew that some renovations had occurred to the top right room, the parlor, because of the later French doors and the windows. Those double doors is where that structural post was cut off. And there's also a fireplace hearth in this room with a solid plaster wall in front of it. So we are assuming that's where that 4th fireplace was covered up. Unfortunately, the interior of the 1.5-story, as I mentioned, was really modified in the 1960s, and a lot of the original finishes and configuration of spaces were taken away. So what does this all mean? We found all these cool things, all these hints, all these clues, and what can we conclude from them, right? So we were able to kind of establish a chronology. So we could find what parts were original. We could find out what parts were altered, and then what was missing, areas that were completely removed or cut off. And so we utilized multiple preservation approaches for this project. The Baldwin Bust House project incorporates demolition, renovation, and restoration. And the restoration is kind of to multiple eras. So, for example, if we said that we were going to restore to the original, 1824, 25 configuration, that means completely eliminating that 2-story structure, right? Because that was the original structure. Anything after that, is a modification. So you have to kind of weigh what makes sense. So frankly, there wasn't enough historic evidence remaining at the L or that 1.5 structure for a full restoration without some significant amount of conjecture. So we took a couple different approaches to renovate the L to kind of suit their new needs for the art gallery space and the community space, and do a full restoration of the exterior, trying to make that look as closely to the 1826 appearance, so when both of those masses were completed. And then kind of this middle ground area in some of the secondary spaces where there is historic material, but for example, a lot has been removed either because we found asbestos or we're trying to, make an office out of them. So it needs some electrical. So trying to update and renovate and rehab there. So there's a lot of different approaches. And then just, I'll end with a couple of photos since it is under construction. Just as the demolition is happening, you can see here the front of the building where that front porch is being removed and revealing the beautiful fan light that's still above the door on the right. At the rear of the building, it's just kind of crazy. You can see the gable end on the top left of each photo, and you can see how much of the 1960s additions have come off and really simplified the massing now. And then the gable end of the 1.5-story L, which we are restoring the roof slope on the left side to match the right side, and adding a porch that will meet the new gallery space. So as I wrap up here, I just want to kind of reiterate that the joy and discovery of kind of figuring out all these pieces um, and how that informs kind of your preservation approaches. But also, one of the toughest things is accepting things that you can't know or won't know, either because you don't want to disrupt valuable historic fabric, or some of the fabric is already gone and you just may never know. So the best you can do is observe and document and continue to ask questions. And so I hope this kind of inspires you to go out there and do that. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kara. This photo in particular is really interesting. Like, how often is it like that you get to kind of take an inside look? Like, you really are peeling away the layers here, like the detail of that fan light that, yeah, you otherwise wouldn't have known that it was still there, right? This is super cool.
Hidden for 100 years, over 100 years.
That is awesome. Okay, let's see. So we do have a couple of questions that have come in here.
Okay.
So maybe let's start with this first one. So the question is, when such high quality materials were used in building a majority of the historic buildings that have survived for hundreds of years, why, maybe do you feel, or maybe have you observed contractors, why don't they replicate those materials or find ways to produce similar materials, maybe in a more economical or natural way?
Sure, that's a great question, and it's a difficult process, and there's kind of a couple different factors to it. I'm going to use siding as an example. So you put siding on your house to protect really the interior of it, right? But in the end, it is kind of a sacrificial layer. That is the material that's taking a beating and weathered. And the great thing about historic materials, especially something like wood that is old growth, it's really dense, it has longevity and moisture resistance and rot resistance. But it's hard. We've used those resources, right? So it's harder to find new ones that will last as long. You just can't get that same quality in new materials, at least not affordably. So the best you can do is really, use salvaged materials or recycled materials is a great option. As long as it's clearly identified, just so you're not confusing future preservationists. But we try to source materials that have, similar appearance and similar qualities, but may not be, the exact same, material. So for example, if we have, I'm going to say, I don't know, pine for siding, or not pine, sorry, trying to think, I think we're yellow poplar at the Baldwin Bus House. It's old growth yellow poplar. We are substituting Western red cedar because it has a lot of those same characteristics, but is available today. So it can be done, just sometimes it's a little bit more difficult.
That makes sense. Yeah, like working within those constraints. And it sounds like maybe it depends on what region you're located in and kind of what's available.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. So let's see. So I think you kind of, we sort of talked about this a little bit with the kind of building maybe chronology or kind of changes over time. But so this question asks, when a building has changes to it that are also pretty old, how do you decide whether to keep those parts or to remove them to make it look more original?
It's a great question. So we typically refer to a period of significance. So, for example, if a building had 3 owners, and owner number 3 is the most historically prominent builder or occupant, that's your George Washington of the house. You may define the era that that person lived there as the period of significance, and that you want to restore to the appearance as it was then. If it's a case where it's not just one person but multiple, then you might have something like the Baldwin Bus House, where you're kind of restoring to multiple periods, and that's okay.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think I feel like a lot of the times what's so interesting about buildings that have been used for so long is that change over time and kind of seeing that evolution. And that's
cool. You don't just want to erase history, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's see. So this question kind of maybe ties in there. So you mentioned period of significance, which we know is sort of an important piece of National Register eligibility. So this question asks if being listed on or eligible for, I'm going to assume, on the National Register impact or limit your options on a project like this.
Not necessarily. So it's kind of a common misunderstanding that the National Register, if you're listed on there, you can't touch a property, you can't make any changes to it. Really, the local legislation has the largest control over kind of what you do to your buildings and local ordinances. So although you may be eligible for National Register listing, if you're listed locally, those are the kind of review boards and review processes that need to kind of be undertaken. Does that answer your question?
I think so. Yeah, no, and that makes total sense. And I think that's such an important part or point to make, Kara. I think there's a lot of like misunderstanding maybe sometimes about how that works and kind of what limitations are. And maybe, or don't exist at all.
Yeah. And maybe you're getting away with really unsavory practices. I hope nobody in this group, I'm sure, but sometimes that's what happens, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, definitely. All right, so let's see. So we have just a couple more minutes here, but I think we're doing well. We've got a couple more questions. So one is there a label or maybe a name for the squatty style of the 1.5 story element? So maybe the fact that it looks kind of squished and.
Yeah, so it kind of looks like maybe like a little log cabin, right? Or something a little primitive, I guess. And I can't say that there is a real exact name for it, but I will say that they dressed it up, right? So maybe I can go back to another photo here, but we're assuming that when they built the 2-story portion of the building, they added kind of the dental molding and let me see here, that they added kind of these, it's a little hard to see, sorry, but there is dental molding here and brackets. There was a fancier kind of column porch post. So I think it was kind of maybe an existing structure without much style, and then they tried to unite the two by putting those kind of little architectural details on. So no, I don't have a real name, sorry.
No, that's awesome. I mean, see, I think that's it just there. That's what you did, right? You described it. Maybe something doesn't always have a name or like adhere specifically to one style or something like that, but there are ways to kind of describe what you've observed to kind of drive the point home and explain what exists.
Yeah. Yep.
Awesome. All right. So maybe we'll just do these last two questions are, I think, kind of similar, and maybe this is a good place to end. So basically, do you have any good books, websites, or other types of resources for homeowners or just anybody who's interested to learn about how to study and observe buildings in this way?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a ton, but Actually, I think the most practical are the National Park Service's preservation briefs. If you're looking for kind of really specific material-minded kind of analysis, just there's a brief for historic plaster, there's a brief for steel windows, for architectural investigation. They're kind of really short, 4 or 5 page documents that are great kind of to start your education. So they're all free, and they're all listed on the National Park Service's website. So I recommend checking those out.
That's awesome. That's a awesome suggestion. And what we can even do too, I think one of the questions asked, is there an organization that, can provide these types of details? And I would say, yes, it's us. Please feel free to go to our website. You can write to info@preservationdE.org. That's kind of the general mailing list, but you can also find any of us. I think, Preservation Delaware is active on social media as well. So, questions like that, I think, our group or somebody, that maybe is affiliated, or one of our colleagues, are always more than willing to make suggestions or recommendations for things to look at, or even just, if you have a photo of something, I think there are a lot of groups on social media that are always open to having those discussions and kind of giving you ideas on what maybe we're seeing.
I think we're all curious at heart, so we're always happy to investigate.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I know we're a little bit over time here, so I want to be cognizant of that and let everybody get on with their nights. But Kara, thank you so much for taking the time out to do this. This was awesome. So many great pictures. And yeah, looking forward to hearing how this project maybe goes in the future, or anything else new that you get. This was so
might have to do a follow-up when it's finished.
Yeah, I would know. I think that'd be really interesting. So yeah, thank you again. As we mentioned at the top, this is being recorded, so it'll be posted to Preservation Delaware's YouTube channel. You can find more information on our website. Also, before you go, if you want to go into the chat, posted some links in there, but I want to kind of call everybody's attention to the last link that I posted, which is actually a survey. So Kara actually helped put this together. We're hoping to get some input from you all on what topics or sort of ideas, things that you're interested in learning more about, that maybe we can make a topic for a future educational webinar or event. So we're really would love to hear from you on that if you have any ideas. But with that, I want to say, I think we're going to take a break for maybe the rest of the summer, but our next webinar we're targeting for September. So please keep an eye out on our website and our socials for an announcement on that. But with that, I just want to say, Kara, thank you again so much. And thanks to everybody for attending. Hopefully we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.